The member for Mirrabooka.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak in support of the Soil and Land Conservation Amendment Bill 2021, and I must confess I didn't realise how much I wanted to talk about soil until I had the opportunity to start preparing. So I had the opportunity to start preparing my notes, and as the Leader of the House observed earlier this morning, that's no doubt because I'm of the soil, to use his words, by which I think he meant I'm a country girl. And it's true. It is true that I guess that is in part why I had an interest in talking on this initially, and and indeed, some of my early memories growing up in the country go to the question of soil conservation. So my dad, as I've reported previously, farmed between Kojonup and Broome Hill. And actually in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, before it was fashionable to be involved in conservation and environmental protection issues, my dad was really committed to wide-scale tree planting on his farm as a way of protecting his land, particularly from the impacts of salinity. And so each year he undertook to fence large areas, relatively large areas of the land off, and he planted in that very hardy, salt-tolerant trees as a way of ensuring that we were dealing with the issues around the water table and encroaching salinity in that area. Now, my whole family was enlisted in the task of planting those trees, and I have to confess I was a very reluctant conscript to the task. I was probably about 10 or so years old at the time. It always took place in the early days of winter, so it was usually wet and usually fairly cold, and I always felt I had much better things to be involved in than planting many, many young trees. But nonetheless, we were all conscripted to do it. What I think of now when I look back at that time, and I look back at the work that my dad was involved in on that property over a long period of time, is the really fundamental change that took place on that farm over the 30 years he farmed. And I think almost every year he selected patches of land to plant with trees as a way of mitigating the encroaching sort of issues around salt. So every year he had a plan. We were kind of dropped out of the plan fairly early on, no doubt because of our complaining. But he planted a significant number of trees. And over the course of many decades, it really transformed the look of that land. So it did its job in terms of preserving the quality of that land as farmland, but it also led to enormous stands of trees across the ridges and through the valleys, which by the time he sold that property had grown into mature trees, which were wonderful habitat for birds and insects and animals, but also provided barriers for wind and barriers for stock. And I've often sort of reflected back on that because I was not interested at all as a young child, but now, of course, can understand that he was involved in very important work that was about ensuring that that property and that land was going to be conserved so that it would remain viable and very productive agricultural land, not just for him, but importantly for the people who came along and bought that property on his retirement. And the member for Thornley talked in his contribution about how the issue of soil conservation really goes to not just the interests of individuals, but in fact we need to approach it as understanding that the actions of others have a collective impact. So my dad was committed to his farm. But what we require with soil conservation is a recognition that what happens on neighbouring properties, in this case, and what happens for those farmers that come after him will have an impact on that soil health. It is a long-term project to protect and help our soil recover, because in fact soil degradation happens over many years, and consequently its rehabilitation takes many years and in some cases generations to be able to give effect to it. I should also just, in my brief comments today, note that clearly a love of soils is something that stayed with me because I married a gardener, and anyone who spent time with gardeners, either because they garden themselves or because, like me, they have a close relationship with one, will understand that in fact soil is fundamental to anything productive growing, and that enormous amount of, particularly in Perth where we have very sandy soil, an enormous amount of time goes into making sure that those soils are very productive, very healthy. It's nearly an obsessive interest in our house. So for someone who hasn't personally thought a lot about soils, I'm surrounded by people who indeed do. But I think what's really interesting and important about this bill is the recognition, firstly, that our soils are in fact incredibly delicate and incredibly precious. I think we don't tend to think about soil very much. It's just something that's always there. We don't think of it as being scarce or precious in the same way we do with water, and that's probably because we can see water when it's scarce. We can see our dams aren't full. We notice it's not raining as much. So we're conscious of the issue of water scarcity. And we don't really think of soil as a living thing in the same way that we do our trees and our forests. And again, we see them very obviously as being living. And yet soil is really an essential part of our food supply. It's an essential part of, in fact, sustaining our life on Earth. Members, it's not just an obsession here in Western Australia, where we do have particularly delicate soils, as the member Thornley's outlined. It's actually a global concern. The UN holds World Soil Day on the 5th of December each year, and central in that is a consideration about recognising that we need to educate people about the importance of soil and have a call to action about improving soil health. One of the key parts of Goal 15 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals goes to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So right in the core of that sustainable development goal is the question of land degradation, and of course soil is a key part of that. So it is something that we are very conscious of here in Western Australia because of the nature of the soils that we have, but indeed it is a global concern and one that quite rightly this government is addressing through this particular bill. We've heard a little bit about this bill and again the member for Thornley I think quite rightly talked about how it was first presented in 1945, so some time ago, that we were first turning our minds to the question of soil and land conservation. So this bill is addressing certain parts of it. I'm very pleased to see that it's actually amending the language throughout the Act to make it gender neutral. But it's also, I think, important that it is addressing the question of having a contemporary management and selection process for members of councils and committees of the boards that oversee it. Because protecting and preserving our soil health, it makes good economic sense, but it's also important for the environment. And by way of illustrating, I suppose, that importance, the agri-food industry here in WA produces nearly $11 billion every year as a result of our state's soil. About 180,000 people are employed in the agri-food business. And we also have a reputation, and one that I think we could do more work to grow, for having clean and green agricultural practices here in Western Australia. And critically, our soils are fundamental to the ongoing success and viability of our regional communities. If we didn't have viable soil, many of those regional communities would cease to operate in the way they do. So it is actually really important for our economy, for one of our significant industries being the agri-food industry, but it's also really important for social cohesion and the ongoing viability of our regional communities. Soil health is critical to so much that we do here in Western Australia. Now again, I'm just conscious of time, but the member for Thornley did talk a little about the issues of salinity, and that is, I think, a particular challenge for Western Australia. But there are, of course, other ways that land's degraded over time, both by way of losing our perennial vegetation, erosion, whether it's water or wind erosion, and the rising water table, which we've already sort of touched on. But the issue of salinity, I was, very much turning my mind to that, because that was really fundamental to, I suppose, my father's concerns about his farm. So the planting of those trees was really a way of making sure that that salinity didn't increase, and in fact to reverse it over a long period of time. Salinity is a big issue in Western Australia, and you only have to catch a plane from Perth to the east and look out the window and see the great big white salt pans that you fly over to understand that land that's covered in that sort of white crust grows nothing. But of course there's many years degradation in the lead up to that sort of very obvious and visual impact of the soil being affected. And so there's, according to the Auditor General report in 2018, about between 1 and 2 million hectares of land in WA has been affected by salinity, and that's got the potential to rise to nearly 5 million over a period of time. It is a really significant issue in this state, and one that we need to take seriously. And as I say, I think for many people we don't think very often about the state of our soils. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak on this bill. I did promise I'd constrain my comments. I did find that once I got into the topic, I felt I could go for a very long time on the question of soil and salinity in particular, but it is a very serious issue. This Act is an important step. I particularly want to commend the Minister for the provisions in this bill that will modernise the Soil Ministerial Advisory Council membership, because I think at the heart of that is a recognition that we need to strike the right balance, and we do need to strike a balance between understanding the needs of industry but also understanding that soil conservation is about conservation, it's about land management. There's clearly a role for local government, and there's an important role for science, which is developing in this area very quickly. So this bill will ensure that advisory council now has an appropriate mixture of skills, people with an appropriate mix of experience and viewpoints, so that we can strike that really important balance. And I do commend the Minister for putting that in place. It's a really important step to make sure that we've got expertise guiding the decisions of the Minister in this area as we confront what I think is a real challenge for Western Australia and for the agricultural industry into the future. I'll conclude my comments there by saying I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak in support of this bill and commend the Minister for the work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Member.